So when people ask me what this is about or what my talk's about, it always depends on where I am. If I'm in a red state, I say, well, it's a story about a small band of rugged individuals who stand up against the heavy hand of oppressive big government and they triumph in the end. And they go, okay, all right, I like that story. If I'm in a blue state, like here, I say, well, it's basically Avatar meets The Gods Must Be Crazy meets An Inconvenient Truth. I say, great, who's got the film rights? And when my wife asked, Jamie, you're going to be spending 2 years writing a book while I work and you make no money. What's this book about? I said, honey, it's about a wise matriarch whose family doesn't always appreciate what she tells them, but they come back to realize that her wisdom can bring them through a very difficult time. She says, okay, I guess you can write that book. And it is all these things. It is a true story, but it is really, at its essence, a story of how we adapt to less and less water. Not this water, which is representing all the salt water that we can't access, that we can't use. Not even this water, which represents the water locked up in ice and glaciers and the polar caps and rocks beneath us. It's this tiny little marble is all the fresh water that we can use as humans for all our needs, to grow our food, to clean ourselves, to take showers, to cook. Not only that, this is the finite amount, but there's more of us now competing for it. Not just 1 billion a century ago, 7 billion today, 10 billion. We're going to add 3 billion more people, all competing for not just finite amount of water, but less water. And that less water is because of climate change, of course. We're facing longer, drier, hotter years that lift that water off the ground, out of the soil, out of the reservoirs, and into the sky where we can't access it. And it's only going to get worse. Some of this is baked in no matter what we do. So the question then is like, well, what happens after this? And I think that all depends on how we answer two questions in this story. One is, who owns water? And the related one is, what is water worth? Now you might be shifting in your seats. Any of you feel uncomfortable with these questions? Be honest. Yeah, it's just like, whoa. There's nothing sacred. I mean, we've got Amazon, we've got eBay, we've got E-Trade, we've got, MasterCard. Aren't there some things that money can't buy? Is nothing sacred? You've been in good company for these thinking because, we heard a speech attributed to Chief Seattle in 1854 where the white man came and said, hey, we beat you in war, and now we're going to buy your land and push you on a reservation. And he says, well, I gave him a shot, but I have a question for you. Your ways are strange to us. We do not understand. How do you buy the warmth of the land? How do you buy the freshness and the sparkle of the water? If we do not own them, how can we sell them to you? And so we don't have these markets for buying and trading and owning water. And instead, we trust other people to handle those issues. We handle the engineers who say, don't worry, we're going to build dams and we're going to build them and store a lot of water, and that's still happening all over the world, but especially in America. We've built like 75,000 dams, and that's great until it isn't. You can't store rivers that don't flow. You can't trap runoff that doesn't happen. And then now we say, well, let's trust the hydrologists. They say, don't worry about surface water. We're going to pump water from the ground. We're going to lift it up, and there's plenty down there. Turns out there isn't. This represents where the level of California was 100 years ago, and it's been crashing down in this process called subsidence. As we suck up all that water, the earth collapses inward. And so we can no longer store that water, and now we've hit that crisis of groundwater. The environmentalists, bless them, say, well, we've got the scientific research, and we've got the facts, and we've got the information, so if we just get that out there to people, they'll realize that we need to save these aquatic ecosystems. And they're not doing it. It's like, well, let's say it again. Let's give them these facts louder this time and more often. And the results are predictable. Without the motivation, people say, well, someone else is handling this. That's not my problem. I'm doing my part. I'm paying my taxes. And so then the government steps in and says, okay, we're going to ration water. We're going to regulate it. We're going to restrict it. And that has predictable results as well. Saying, wait a minute, water is a gift from God. You can't just cut that off to me. That's my lifeline. You don't determine that. And so there's a backlash, and the government usually backs off. And finally, the economists come along and say, look, it's all really simple. All you need to do is tax water. You just need to unilaterally charge 3 times as much as you are already for the same amount of water. And those economists never seem to run for office, because if they did, again, they would recognize that it's political suicide. And so none of these systems work, and we're left with this tragedy of the commons, of more and more people competing for the same amount of water and getting more, angry and tense, and the social stress is building, and we're literally racing each other to the bottom. And this is happening all over the world. 7 billion people all trying to get their piece of this water that is less and less available. The question for me in a panic is just like, geez, if we're not going to have the kinds of situation that we have in Yemen and Syria, what are we going to do? And is there any place on this earth where people are resilient, where they're not depleting their water? And the answer came to me in the last place I looked, in the middle of the Kalahari Desert, the great thirst land, where people had been living longer than humans had been living anywhere. 30,000 years. In the middle of this thirst land where there's no standing water. And yet, there they are. Well, the government didn't want them there. The government says, we want this for diamond mining, we want it for cattle ranching, we want it for tourism. Can you guys just move along, please? Does that sound familiar in America? We want to put you on this reservation. Life will be great for you there. And the Bushmen said, no, we're not leaving. We're going to stay here. And the government says, well, we've been giving you water, we've been pumping it up, we're going to cut that off. Now you're on your own. And they said, okay, that's fine. We've been out here before you came along, and we'll stay out there. But this was a dire situation. They were basically besieged. And I said, geez, I miss the wars with the Native Americans, but I'm not going to let this happen. I am Dudley Do-Right. I'm going to get in my red Land Rover and work with the human rights activists and pile up water and food, and I'm going to head into the Kalahari Desert, and I am going to rescue the Bushmen. And it didn't quite work out the way I planned. I got lost. I broke down. My engine sucked in the sand, and I realized, what was I thinking? These guys have been here for how long, and I'm going to help them? It was basically my conversion on the road to what was Vulture water, Metsiamanong. And I realized, I don't have anything to offer them. But if I can survive out here, if I can find out what makes them tick, how they don't just exist, but how they learn to laugh and dance and tell jokes with each other in this thirst land, maybe that's something I can take back. And so I spent years with them trying to figure out how it worked. And they see the eland. You and I say, oh, graceful animal. They see a walking water tank, because this thing can exist out there without needing to drink water. It gets it metabolically from the grasses that it eats at night. So they hunt their water and energy and food resources. They forage it by looking at not just any baobab, but the pockets that it holds water and under the rocks, and they know where to look and how to find it. They have sip wells that are secret places passed on from generation to generation where the water doesn't evaporate. It's on a little layer, and they know how deep down to bring it up and put it in canteens. Ostrich eggshells or modern plastic if they can get it. And the women, of course, are doing the hard work. They're bringing 80% of the nutrients, the food, and most of the moisture back in what they're able to dig up. They're able to recognize a thin little blade of grass and say, I know under there's a water-holding tuber. I'm going to bring that back. What was surprising to me wasn't just their ingenuity and their resourcefulness, but that they owned these water resources. Once they went out and earned it, once they hunted it, once they gathered it, it was theirs. And they made sure people knew it was theirs. They would mark their canteens, their ostrich eggshell, saying, this belongs to me, this is mine. And there was clear respect for those kinds of water rights ownerships. And they'd adapt whatever they could to store what they'd earned, what they'd worked for. But then the third part of the equation is that I don't need all this eland, I don't need all these sama melons, I don't need all these gourds. So what I don't need myself or for my family, I'm going to exchange with the others. I'm going to, as Adam Smith put it, truck, barter, and exchange the water that we capture, that we don't use. And in so doing, they turn scarcity of water into abundance. They turn potential conflict into cooperation. They're able to build this resilient society on trust, on face-to-face, pure trading mechanisms. And it allowed them to triumph, even as Botswana, even as the government around them was collapsing because of the drought evaporating their centralized reservoir. And so I wrote the book, and I was feeling all proud of myself, and then people point out, it's not just the Bushmen. It's like, oh. No, Aflaj, a 3,000-year-old system in the Arabian Peninsula, has the exact same approach, where they make sure that there's water negotiated and people get shares and they invest in the resource, and there's no central authority divvying up that water among the farmers, among the mosque, among the school, among the villagers. It's like, wow, okay. And even older than that, Persia and modern Iran is Qanat was their system. So Falaj and Qanat. In Morocco, it's a system known as Ketara. Again, in the Atlas Mountains, this is how they beat back scarcity. They negotiated with one another over who got how much water at what time for what purposes. Again, in Chinese, it was Haaretz is the system known. And medieval times in Spain, the Spanish huertas that are still existing to this day around Valencia. In Bali, these sacred water temples for how they irrigate these fields is a system called subak. The World Bank and the Dutch tried to improve on it, gave up and said, no, this is as close to perfection in water management as you get. And in North America, there's traditional acequias that go back 400 or 500 years. Again, these things are working. They're functioning. They're these self-organizing, self-regulating, peer-to-peer trading systems of water. And I was getting very excited, saying, well, this is working everywhere around the world. This is working over thousands of years. And I remember this great quote, not send a man to the moon, an even more important one in my mind, when John F. Kennedy said, anyone who can solve the problems of water will be worthy of 2 Nobel Prizes, one for science and one for peace. And it took 50 years, but someone won that. And her name's Elinor Ostrom, and if she's not a household word yet, she should be, because she's an extraordinary woman. She angered a lot of male economists because she was a female and she wasn't an economist. She was a political scientist, and she devoted her whole career to documenting over 40 years all these systems, whether it was fisheries or forests or pastures or meadows or mushrooms, you name it. The tragedy of the commons is real, but it is not inevitable. That people don't just fall off a cliff or go to war. They start negotiating with each other over who gets how much access to what resource, including water. And this system, she says, there's rules. Very Aristotelian. There's all these different rules of how they do this. And the first thing is defining. Let's figure this out. Who gets the resource? What is the resource? Is it surface water? Is it groundwater? Can anyone have a role in this? Once we've got that clear, let's go to the next thing. How do we defend that share of the resource? Let's make sure that, we're not just going to say, oh, I trust you. We want monitoring, we want enforcement, we want transparency, we want accountability. She's listing all these rules. And then divesting. I want to pass this on to my next generation, to my kids, or I want to sell it if I move to the city, or something that allows me to look ahead. And when you've got these combinations right, when you've got them all in place, the system builds trust. You may say, well, that sounds very complicated. Give me an example of where it works. And one takes place just a few hundred yards from here at the farmers market every week. And there's farmers markets like this everywhere. No one central authority says, okay, you got to set up your stall here and you got to sell these products to these people. It's all dynamic. People negotiate this themselves. It's a magical thing. And this is face-to-face, but the challenge, of course, with water is how do you scale this up? You're not going to have somebody bring in 300 gallons to the farmer's market and say, hey, I didn't use this. Anyone want to buy this? But we don't have to. The beauty of this era that we live in, of course, is that we can use technology to scale and replicate these peer-to-peer systems that have worked so well for so many for so long. And that's what a team and I are trying to do. We've worked starting in Sonoma in California with the Water Foundation and Sonoma Water Agency, Valley of the Moon. We set up, the first trial of this where people earned, owned, and traded and sold their water savings. It soon, caught on, and they started asking, well, we also have this groundwater problem. Can you adapt the system to that? And we said, well, yes, as long as you're playing by these same rules. And so let's define whose straws those are. How much are they sucking up from the ground? How much can be taken each year before it gets replenished? And then let's divvy it out according to a way that you guys feel is fair and appropriate, and set up a mechanism for monitoring it. And it's an inclusive process. You don't just want farmers, you don't want cities, you don't want investors to come in and speculate it into oblivion. You want to make sure that these guys who live on and depend on this water, their water, have a sense of what they're owning, what they're trading, and how it's going to work for them. It's basically, just like when we sit down and divvy up a pizza pie, saying, okay, well, we want to make sure that no one gets too much. We also want to make sure people are included. So we're going to have, individuals. We're going to set aside a reserve. We're going to have institutions. We're going to make sure that, there's concentration caps so that only, no one can get more than 3% of the resource and dominate the others. And this is the system that works. People say, okay, now I know where I fit into the scheme, and I know where others do. Then we build the trust, and that moves on to the sort of defend part. After you've defined it, you defend by monitoring through these smart meters, through remote sensing, through satellite imagery that can track who pumps how much water, what they grow, how many acre feet or cubic meters they're using on their crops. And monitoring not just for economic productivity, yeah, that happens with a market, but is it socially equitable? Is it environmentally sustainable? Is it replenishing the rivers as part of the goals that we've defined early on? Is there market integrity, or is there some corruption going on here? We can monitor all these things now. The whole thing works because people start thinking, instead of, I got to get as much as I can today, they start saying, oh, if I know that I don't use mine, no one else can get that. That's going to be worth something in the future, and it's probably going to be worth a lot more than it is right now. So yeah, I have an incentive to invest in drip irrigation or replace my lawn or grow a different crop in order to put a value on that water. And this is what they see. They start to see for the first time, oh, that green line is what I've used in the past. Whoa, that was a lot. I can use a lot less than that. And so they do. They start finding ways to use the blue line, and that's their share. But that part in between, all this, that's something they're earning now. These are credits. This is basically money in the bank that they can start to see, okay, what do I want to do with this? Who do I want to sell it to? Do I want to donate it? Do I want to make sure that somebody else, can access this if they need it, and at what price? And so far, it's mostly just been, the utilities that buy back the water from their own customers that they save. And they do so because it's cheaper than pumping water. It's cheaper than these conservation programs that they've put in place. It's certainly cheaper than building a dam or a desalination plant. And so the utility likes it because it connects their customers with the provider for the first time. There's none of this us versus them. And that's fine in California. We love the environment, but it's not necessarily a life or death issue, where it is for much of the world. And that's when Harvard University and later the World Bank started to get interested in saying, well, geez, can this work in the developing world? Can we, try this in North Africa and the Middle East? And we said, yeah, let's give it a go. And so they had a small grant to give it a try in Morocco. And Morocco has long ago crossed that sort of threshold into absolute water scarcity. And especially in the inland areas where desalination isn't an option, their dams were evaporating. They're like, yeah, what are we going to do? Because we don't want to have an Arab Spring. We don't want to just sort of ration people against their will. So what are we going to do? And so they gave it a try. And they don't all have laptops. They're not all scanning their water use on an hourly basis or anything like that. But whereas people out there, they may not have access to water, what they do have access, something all you in this room, I'm wagering, have access to, is what? Cell phones. And so that's what we worked with them on. We said, well, we're going to send you updates on how much water you're saving and what it's worth and what we'll pay you if you save that. And it's going to be more than, the utility charges you, and so that works in your favor, but it's going to be less than the utility would have to pay to get new water, so that works in their favor. And it worked. Just as in Sonoma, we had 8 times the level of conservation against control groups at a very low cost, and something that didn't require any infrastructure. So it was really scalable. And Marrakesh, is now saying, well, maybe the hotels can offset their water footprints. That's something we got to look into. That gives a carrot, whereas before there had only been sticks. So while, with technology and the human spirit is our theme here tonight, and it's very easy to get seduced by the technology, by the artificial intelligence, the machine learning, the remote sensing, the distributed ledgers like blockchain and so forth. And yes, those are important. Those are elements of this. But it really boils down to the human spirit. And that's where that wise matriarch, Orklu Dukli, came in. She was the leader in the group. Even though, she didn't exercise sort of dictatorial control, people looked to her for advice. I still remember this one quote from her where she says, when I was young and growing up out here, we lived well. We got our water from the roots and from the trees and from the animals. And we exchanged with one another. But then the government came and started just to give us stuff. And they gave us water. And now that I look back, I think it was to make us dependent on them so that when they took it away, we would have to move. Well, she didn't move, and she showed others that they didn't need to move either. What they needed to do was answer those questions that I raised in the beginning. So next time you guys are thinking about, how are we going to get out of this situation? How are we going to build resilience? How are we going to endure the coming age of permanent drought? You can answer the questions of I think I know who owns water. I own water, and I'm going to decide what it's worth. Thank you.